Okay, let's go. I'll start talking while we all take a seat and just sort of say, I think there was a unanimous recommendation from Gavin's table earlier that we need to do something. I think that was the top recommendation, and I think everybody was agreeing. Everything I heard was we've got to do something. The question is what? One little word, it's not that little, interoperability. But what a big, broad discussion we've had today. Covers so many different topics. And of course, we started with a very convergent exploration of the challenges in this space. And over the next 45 minutes, we have to try and bring that down to a point where we can make 5 clear recommendations to DSED. That is the challenge, the next 45 minutes. We're going to play it fairly loosely, but I'll talk you through the way that we'll do it. On the screen behind me is what some large language model decided we'd been talking about all day. I don't know which one it was. Was it Miro's own? So all the scribes that were taking all the notes, put it all in, and this apparently is what we've been talking about. Now, when I look at that, it doesn't necessarily instantly jump out what the recommendations are. But maybe my eminent panel will be able to see those patterns. And that's what we're going to try and do now. But I'm going to start by asking each of my panel to introduce themselves and just share with us what they heard today that they thought was that they want to sort of pick up on, recognizing that this has to be a wholly democratic process. So our job is not to lead the witness. Our job is to somehow make sure that what we've heard today comes out clearly and the process takes us to that stage. So, Paul.
Is this working? Yes, yes. Hi, Paul Clark. I co-chair something called the Robotics Growth Partnership. In terms of what's most relevant for this today, it's the kind of the analog of the AI Council, which I used to be on when it still existed. But it really helps government think about policies and strategies for harnessing the power of smart machines and robotics and drones and the rest. And we also authored an initial vision for cyber physical infrastructure, which was published in 2022. And previous to that, I was also CTO of Ocado for many years. So I suppose some of in terms of the themes that have particularly stuck out for me, one is the long list of things that we need to architect for. And I won't go through them, maybe they'll come out in the discussion, but it is king as always, but also the fact that the emergent nature of this and how we have to in particularly architect for it being an emergent creative thing is not something we're just going to be able to kind of create in one go. And that also means the fact that we have to accommodate the old and the new, as we talked about. So the sort of how we retrofit this to the existing built environment and the rest, but also how we have a vision for where we would like to take it in the future. And I'll pass over.
Sarah Cameron, I'm a legal director at the law firm Pinsent Masons, focused very much on the data and digital arena, and I'm co-chair of the Governance and Trust Working Group for the Digital Twin Hub. I learnt a lot today listening to some amazing brains talking around the table. I suppose what I took away, particularly having been asked to focus on the Interoperable Europe Act, which is, after all, simply about increasing access to public services and data across member states, and has got some quite simple requirements about interoperability, impact assessments, sharing best interoperable solutions, having a board to ensure network across member states to have a sort of cohesive plan for making this work and so on, is, yes, I think that's incredibly easily translated into simple legislation in this country. We already have, in theory, best practice around it in the digital and data and technology playbook and the technology code of practice. I learned there's something very similar in the energy space. Why on earth can't there be one cohesive version of this that's used across government? But in any event, make it simple and legislate if that makes it happen more quickly. Apparently a simple letter from Secretary of States across their public sector organizations saying, what are you doing about interoperability? What are you doing about data sharing? What are you doing about complying with best practice according to various playbooks and so on, would kickstart some pretty quick action pending further regulation, if that's the right approach. So that's enough from me.
Oh, thanks. Sir.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Michelle Birdie. Oh, there we go. I'm the head of data for the electricity system operator for the UK. I'm part of National Grid. We're becoming an independent corporation later this year, so we'll be playing a different role within the UK. And I've been with the company for about 10 months, and before that I was in the banking industry. So this is very interesting and very different for me to listen to these kinds of conversations. What I took away from today was a lot around people. So yeah, we're talking a lot about technology, but a lot of this is around how do we make this successful will depend on people, culture changes, and different ways of thinking outside of the typical way that we work in silos. And that's hard. That's really difficult. So it's not just all the technology that we need to do and not the standards that we need to put in place and the legislation and all that stuff. It's also how do we get people engaged, their hearts and their minds. And I think that that's going to be very challenging. So I'm also particularly interested in the data standards and the governance around the data.
Hello, I'm Charles Cadelli. I'm the CTO for Esri Holdings in the UK and Ireland. A few things came out today. One of them was you can take the word AI and replace it with the word magic box. That came across quite strongly. Data standards will not create interoperability. They may facilitate it, but coming up with data standards will not create interoperability. Interoperability is a human problem. Technology is in many ways the easy part. It might be hard technical problems, but we have people who can tackle those. The hard problem is creating an environment where people want to and need to interoperate and they get the benefits from it. And that's the challenge that we have to face. Just one other small thing is data sharing is not interoperability as well. It can facilitate that, it can support that. I think one interesting analogy that came out is in the world of financial reporting. Every organization in the UK has to create a financial report that we can read on Companies House, we can assess it, we can look at things like the viability of those businesses and so on, but we're not seeing their spreadsheets in detail. We're just looking at the output to questions we ask of those businesses. Completely separately, there's an auditing process, and those auditors have complete access to all the information those businesses have, so they can validate that what we've been told is correct. I think there's some sort of analogy there between interoperability, which is the questions we need to answer of each other, and auditing of that, and the governance of that, and the provenance of that, which is more like an auditing task. And that's an interesting analogy to draw upon.
Great. Well, fantastic panel, very diverse, lots of different points of view. Everybody, I think, coming with slightly different perspective on this. But before I jump in, has anybody got any pressing, burning questions they'd like to throw at anybody to kick off? Otherwise, I'm just going to go and look at this list of things that we've talked about and pick off bits and pieces and ask the panel to talk about it in the context of looking to make some recommendations. Obviously, rather than everybody talking about everything here, we won't have enough time for that. If there are things that you feel more strongly about and feel more expert about, then please come forward. Let's do it that way. And what I'll do is try and pull out the recommendations, and then we'll have a little discussion. And then after that, I'm going to ask for a quick vote as to whether or not people think that's a good idea or it's not a good idea. We're going to use that rough, approach to work out whether or not we can prioritize a few of the recommendations that come out from today. Does that sound fair, democratic, sensible, workable? We'll see. Okay, so the top of the list here, we've got regulators, good practice, ministerial letters. There's a bit of legislation and regulation jumping out at the top. Sarah, you were on the table, I think, that actually said very quickly, in about one sentence, yes, we should copy the EU Act, and then moved on from there, which was a fairly punchy statement, I thought, to open with. But should we? I mean, is this something we should do? Why should we do it? What happens if we don't do it?
Effectively, we should be doing it already in the public sector. It's just as we said, it's fragmented, the instructions on how and where to do it across government departments and not necessarily being implemented anyway. And I asked someone here earlier, who's responsible for this in government overall to see this action is taken around interoperability, and there's no clarity. So at least let's have somebody responsible for the top for overseeing this across the public sector. And then you can implement these specific limited requirements.
I mean, there used to be somebody, and maybe there will be for another however many days it is, which was the NSTC, which was trying to get all the children in the playground to play nicely with one another and share their toys, as I like to put it. But, in terms of getting government departments to collaborate around technology, including what we're talking about today. But I would like to widen that point and actually say, I think there is a massive obligation and opportunity for government to lead by example across, the whole inception of cyber physical infrastructure, because it needs it, but because it could lay the foundations for industry to then crowdsource in on that in terms of innovation and investment. But so I think using public procurement, as we talked about earlier, to seed that process and to get things heading in the right direction and to build the emergent standards, including around interoperability, and to see that as something that government can do with existing money, as opposed to something that it has to fund as a separate exercise. So it will benefit it, but that requires a mindset shift. It requires a cyber physical infrastructure first approach. It requires them to think about that when they're building public services and national infrastructure. And that's the challenge for me.
Can I just ask, is that a second recommendation around procurement, separate than the act that we talk about?
But I think leading by example is one, and then I think the second one is kind of using government, using public infrastructure, national infrastructure, using public services as a way to get this ball rolling, and to drive that emergence and that learning by doing.
Gavin? I don't know how we're doing this with the mics, but Sarah, anybody? We got a spare mic. We've been struggling with the mic. Go for it.
We had the DPDI bill going through Parliament. In that, there was a smart data piece of it, just for disclosure. I'm the co-chair of the Smart Data Council. And within that, we've published a roadmap for smart data adoption across the UK. And that roadmap has also had budget allocated to DESNES, DFT, and others to say, get on with it. And Open Finance already has a task force looking at the future of smart data across the financial sector. So I think the UK has, there are bits of the EU kind of interoperability piece which, are symbiotic with what we're already doing, I would say. But I'd say that equally join up its industry approach and its policy approach that I don't see as joined up in other jurisdictions. And I wonder maybe, Sarah, if you could comment on that cohesiveness.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that we've led the way with open banking, which is about opening up customer data to increase competition in that sector. And I completely agree with you about the now stalled DPDI Part 3 for the smart data agenda being taken forward with its roadmap, as you say. The Interoperable Europe Act, I see that as different because that's public sector sharing for access to public services. So they're slightly different things in my view. And yes, we can run with the learnings that we've got from open banking already to pick up and carry on with what's happened with DPDI.
Consumer as a citizen data. No. It's also business data.
Exactly, but it's not public sector is my distinction, yeah.
Well, we're trying to align SME data rules with as closely as is relevant to GDPR. So we end up with one way of doing things. So to your earlier comment of, can we just combine all these different rule books? I'd say there's a lot of movement in that direction. And what we need, as I mean collectively, is more use cases to say, well, this is a good idea. And more examples of what kind of value this is going to unlock for the economy.
Agreed.
So, sorry, can I come back on that? So with the Smart Data Council, what authority does that have with respect to other institutions?
It doesn't. I think it's a coalition that includes lots of different government departments, as well as non-government representatives. Up until obviously the election was called, as co-chairing alongside Minister Hollenrake. We fully expect it to continue with the next administration, but it doesn't have it can't mandate anything. But we did work with in the last budget cycle to unlock budget so that particularly DFT and DESNES could hire their own smart data teams so they can actually properly start work in this. But I'd say that there's a lot of work to do. But the question I know you're angling for is like who has a big stick to mandate things. I think it's an open conversation. Why this is really useful today. What institutions already exist that could help with mandating things, and what glue is needed to make sure that they all do it the same way. And I don't think there's a one ring to rule them all kind of institution. There might be some function inside Cabinet Office or some function somewhere that could help with that, but I think it's a big conversation.
I'm just going to turn to Michelle as well, as she obviously is has an important role to play going forward in the energy system to consider the role of regulator and legislation.
I don't really have anything to add to what's already been said. I do think that I agree with you that there is a role for the regulator to mandate some of this, because especially if it's in the good of the public, it should be mandated. But I agree with all the comments that have already been made.
Okay, so maybe it's time for a quick show of hands then on some of the things that have just come out there. So there's a very specific one on whether we take the Interoperable Europe Act and essentially enshrine it into UK law, or however we do that. But I think there was a clever way of working with the letters from the Secretary of State to get that ball rolling. So I don't think it's straight to that point. Does everybody think letters from the Secretary of State out to ask people what they're doing is a good recommendation? How are we going to measure this? That's like I think that's like a 2 out of 5, half-hearted, 2 out of 5. Okay, so that the letter of letters from the Secretary of State. What about combining the rule books that we've got, attempting to combine the rule books and building on top of everything that we've already got there, linked back to some of the work that's going on in Gavin's smart data world? Is that a 2 as well? Or is it 2.5 maybe? 3. What about the government leading by example and driving its procurement programs in a way that will ensure that CPI is first? I think that's a 3. 3? We're up there. So at the top at the moment is government 4. We think there's a 4. Government leading by example. That sounds like a very good one. And then in terms of the role of the regulators, I think today we were talking earlier about the fact that regulators need to regulate what they're regulating, but we also talked about something gluing. I think Gavin, your word was glue. How do we glue things together? Is there a recommendation here that we could unpack around the gluing together? And maybe we'll just have a little panel discussion first before we have another show of hands. Anybody think about the glue? How does that work?
Well, I think what Mark Enzer was talking about at the start, that adopting that systems thinking approach, once again, across government as a starting point, but also, very much architecting for that, which inevitably brings me to the topic of Lego, which is, we need to be building those solutions across government, in a common, out of common blocks, both in terms of data and and both physical and digital, so that they interoperate, so they don't cost as much, so they're less risky, so they're more maintainable, so they're better understood, so that they have the same spares, so that they have the same skill sets required to manipulate them, etc., etc. So, you know, that once again is a sort of an architectural or solutions pattern that the government could adopt and try and drive. And it's quite timely, because one of the last things that Patrick Vallance did before he handed over to Dame Angela was to initiate a whole program around trying to get more systems thinking into government and getting GoScience to do that. So why don't we build on that? Because you know, we need better joined up systems across our public services, across national infrastructure, let alone across the planet.
Charles, I can see you wanted to grab for that.
If we take one of the points that's on there, in that data infrastructure is infrastructure, we know infrastructure needs regulation. It needs governance, it needs oversight. Otherwise it gets leaky. And I think it's just a really important point.
Does that go back to representing the legislation, the act that we proposed earlier again? Can I re-propose the act that we... I didn't propose it, I jumped on. The EU Act. Do we copy the EU or not? That's a... So Sarah, the EU Act, maybe it's not something that people are familiar with. I know you gave an introduction to it earlier, but the EU Act was enshrined into the by the Commission in April, wasn't it? And this essentially says that if you're delivering public services across Europe, you must follow a few things. And they're not that difficult to follow, but you've got to do an assessment that says we've done an interoperability assessment, and we are able to, and we know what the impact of what we're building as a service is to deliver across the nations. And obviously they've got the extra complication of all the different languages as well. But they've got to do something that says we've done an assessment. We know whether or not this is going to be interoperable. And that will also impact the controls at customs and taxes, which means that if we want to trade with the EU, we're going to have to fall into line with their Interoperability Act. If we don't, that's fine. But I did see something recently at the Port of Dover that said if we're not careful, it's going to take us 20 days to get across the channel. You're going to be queued back up to Maidenhead or something, if we're not careful, because of what's coming down the line from the EU. And I think the Interoperability Act is right at the heart of this. And if we want to be able to maintain the right relationships with them from a data sharing perspective, I think it's important. Well, I don't want to lead the witness here. Does anybody else? Because it was put forward earlier as being something we should take forward. Is it something that we should look deeper into and consider whether or not we should adopt this? Do people think we should look at this deeper and see whether or not this... Okay, I think that's at least a 4, isn't it? Yes.
To getting interoperability done.
It's not doing any more than what should be happening already.
And I think that's very much the point. It feels to me like a bit of a red herring question. I think much bigger questions that we should be tackling, because getting interoperability at national level for public sector data is a relatively, and I use that word with capital letters, a relatively more straightforward thing to do than the really tough things that we're wading into around things like smart data.
Okay, so we recognise it's an easier challenge than some of the other challenges. Mark has got a point.
That's so mean, but it might be true. So I think we should all put our hands up just so that you don't get us to vote for the same thing again. But I'm being cheeky. I was wondering if I could turn what Paul said into a recommendation. So like the regulator recommendation, because I think what...
Yeah, please.
So what this would be is that we would get the data and digital recognized as a class of infrastructure to be recognized by each relevant regulator as part of their remit. And in addition to that, Why does it always stop when I have the most important thing to say?
It's the punchline.
And, and in addition to that, it's got a punchline detector, hasn't it? In addition to that, there would be an intentional connection between those pieces in the individual regulators. So it would be put in each regulator, plus connected between each regulator, a proper recognition of data and digital as an asset class of infrastructure.
Shall we vote on that? Okay, that's a good 5. Is that a 5? Do you think? 5. Well done.
Eloquently put.
Well done, Paul and Mark, for just cleaning it up.
This glue is what's connecting the regulators. Why do they have to work together on this?
There was.
So it would be based on use cases. So where there's a purpose for them to be working together. So for example, if we want to be talking about the connection between energy and transport, because there's a specific thing about electric cars being part of both, that at that point they need to come together for a purpose, driven by.
And I know earlier on when you were summarising, Sarah, you were talking about the fact that perhaps there was a need for a data regulator that would be the part of that glue. Is that something we can explore as well? I don't know if, Gavin, that's related to it or not. That's right.
When we're talking about interoperability and glue, it unpacks into quite a lot of thorny issues quite quickly. So things like digital identity is one of the first ones. And if we're going to have a national policy around digital identity, I'll leave that to other people to have a conversation around. But when we're looking at interoperability between sectors, the technology is not a technology problem. It's a rules-based problem. We need to look at the data rights, the liabilities, and the use cases, as Mark. I just want to endorse what Mark said, basically. It needs to be use case led. I don't think that we need or that a macro body that mandates some kind of technical interoperability needs to exist or can exist, because at that level, you're really at the IETF kind of macro. How does data go over the internet? And then the use cases are going to be so diverse, and as soon as you get, we had one meeting with the FCA when they said, let's do open banking across the rest of the financial economy. And we got the insurance sector and pension funds and so on around the table. And they all went, we're special, we need our own special thing. And it's taken us 10 years to get to open finance. I don't want to be waiting another 10, I'll be retired by the time we get to the table for that. So I think we need to progress rapidly. We can mandate certain things like thou shalt be interoperable and define broadly what that means in primary legislation, which we're doing. And then the regulators can take that and say, this is how it applies in our sector, and then use the use cases to look at those cross-sector initiatives. It's an incredibly thorny issue, and it's easy to trip.
For a brief moment today, we embraced the physical on 2 tables, and then we've gone back to the digital again. So I'm going to drag the physical screaming back in here and say, if we're talking about regulation, we must regulate for the exceptions and the experimentation, particularly when it comes to the physical, because, we've already, as we were talking about on one of the tables today, seen too much technology, born into captivity in the form of autonomous vehicles and drones. And the same will happen around cyber-physical infrastructure if we don't make sure that part of the regulatory mindset is, whether it's the Regulatory Pioneers program or whatever, is around how we license the experimentation and exceptions at a national scale, so that we're not playing guerrilla warfare across government, across local councils every time you want to do an experiment. And the physical experiments are perceived to be way more risky than the digital experiments.
So one of the other things that came up quite a lot today was large language models, and whether or not these perhaps had got some place going forward. It feels like we're not quite there yet, but everybody's sort of thinking that there is a place here. Is this a place that we need to think about further research and development programs that are targeted to understand the impact of AI, large language models, on interoperability? It looks like Charles might have an answer on this one.
I don't think so. The scale at which we need to interoperate is vast, and the landscape across which we have to interoperate is not perfect. But organizations do not have perfect data, perfect systems, perfect processes. One of the questions on the table earlier on was, what's your future vision? And somebody said, utopia, everybody sharing and so on. My future vision is a system that can cope with what we have and can work with the reality of what we're able to sustain as humans. I see a need for automation of interoperability. Interoperating across the banking sector, I think, is relatively easy because the systems are self-similar. Financial transactions are financial transactions. It's relatively easy to get consensus across that. Similar for airplane tickets, they're selling similar things. They've had a lot of success in harmonizing their systems. We need to interoperate between water systems, electrical systems, landscape systems, financial systems, individual personal identity systems, everything. Every system has to talk to every system. That's not going to happen unless we can automate it. And the only way we can automate at that scale is probably to use AIs. Now, whether a large language model can do it, the architecture of a large language model, I think, has moved in the right direction. But there's additional fundamental work needed to look at how do you get systems to interoperate between each other safely. Because large language models have got a failure of confabulation, where they make things up from the underlying statistical data. There's a need for fundamental research, absolutely fundamental research, in how to use AI to support interoperability. And that's something I think the UK is very well placed to do. And a strong recommendation should be to DISA is facilitate this research and keep it constrained on a goal, which is getting the systems that we have today, not the future perfect systems that we'd like there to be, but the systems we have today, let's make them interoperate at an appropriate level or an achievable level. So large language models are probably a good starting point for some of this, but fundamental research is needed. One other point, is AIs only work if they've got training data. That training data probably doesn't exist for interoperating systems at the level we want to do it at. But we have people who are linking those systems together. We have to harness the work they're doing to create training data for these future AIs. And that in itself is another program that needs done. And it's probably going to take a number of years to get the sufficient level of training data.
Training AI is phenomenally expensive.
Exactly.
One way you get at it is by building a sufficiently detailed attention graph, if you like. That looks awfully like an interoperation graph. And so that it may be the other way around, but building that gives you the ability to then bootstrap your language model to improve it.
Yeah, but I think what we need is people who are targeted in this problem space, and they should. There's work that we need to do over the next 4 or 5 years to link systems as best as we can, and we should be harnessing what we're doing there to train those future models and creating that environment.
We've got a question over here.
Rather than a question. I think we need, from an infrastructure perspective, particularly physical, we need to learn the lessons from CDDB in terms of what we tried to do with information modeling. That demonstrated how difficult it was within the construction sector, which is fairly well bounded, to come up with common language.
Exactly.
We couldn't even agree what the definition of a door was as part of product data. We need to, as it were, walk before we run. And I really think we need to think quite hard about how we get to that language. Just throwing it at an LLM, having experimented with some of the current ones, we're going to get chaos.
Exactly, which is why we need targeted research, and it's not just take what's there.
And Charles, I know in the past you've talked about the way that we've solved this is recognizing the byproducts of these systems rather than trying to put something new in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think the businesses that we work with, a lot of the utilities I work with personally, they do great jobs up to a point, but they struggle to keep their own systems up to date for their day-to-day business processes. If we require them to create additional systems, additional data stores for the purposes of interoperating, they won't be able to achieve it. Somehow we've got to harness what we have today to do ideally, interoperability should be a byproduct of what people already do. And I think that's the approach we have to take.
So I think there's a recommendation, there's a clear recommendation here. There might be two parts to it, but we're recommending fundamental research targeted in the use of AI, large language models, for interoperability, and alongside that, working out how we use people that are already doing this job in order to train the systems. So who thinks that's a good one, or do anybody wants to answer questions first of all? Questions first?
It's my personal view that the interoperability is a prerequisite. We should look at this other way around.
Agreed.
We should not use AI to help the interoperability. We should use interoperability to help AI.
Thumbs up from Gavin. That counts for
A large language model, because it's holding a semantic field, if you like. It's quite good at solving that problem of how do you define a door. The answer is you can't define a door, but you can define a typical door, and you can sort of model out how near the thing is to your typical door. So there are ways in which it can help you get there faster.
I'm going to go right to the back. There's a question there.
Of the interoperability flagship project run by Digital Catapult into using LLM for interoperability problems.
Yes, it is.
Right? So absolutely, they're looking at, there is a specific use case around embodied carbon, but it is about interoperability challenges and using LLM. And Chanel has done some fantastic research on it.
Yeah.
Review. There will be another observer gallery quite shortly. So please reach out to the project manager, reach out to me if you want to see that happening.
Sure. So I'm from Digital Catapult. I was just going to mention that. So it can be assistive, but AI is not going to solve it. It's going to put the data in a shape that is desired. Okay, and that desire is that regulation or initiative that's going to try and set a boundary. That's a comment. So my question is, would the panel agree that we have the technologies available, but it is rather the initiatives, the willingness, or the methodology that has to be built to achieve interoperability? Would you agree that the technology actually exists to achieve this?
Yeah.
No. Not at the scale at which we have to do it, in the time frame that we have to achieve it, with the current state of the data that's available to us.
And to do it in real time at scale. And I think one of the sorry? Which use case are you talking? I'm talking about, sorry? I'm afraid I'm going to inevitably come at it from the point of view of the physical world. If we want real-time, if we want physical systems to interoperate, in a scalable way, and work as systems, then there are a lot of missing pieces, including the fact that we're still not building things with the open plumbing that allows us to collect the data that could then allow us to train the models to actually understand what is going on, in real time, but also to be able to control them in this kind of scalable, joined up way. So before you start worrying about the AI, we have to think about how we're going to put the plumbing in place to collect the data. And to quote Matt Damon again, we're going to have to instrument the shit out of the real world in order to be in a better place to be able to build the models to control it.
Okay, so I was about to put forward a question which I thought was a recommendation around fundamental research targeted into interoperability that also had a bit of AI on there. I think a bit of pushback on whether or not we've already got enough AI, whether it's got the key bit there, but still, let's just go out there. Do we need to is there more fundamental research that needs to be done in order for us to crack this problem? or have we got it cracked and we've got the tech and it's other stuff that we need to deal with? Who thinks we need investment in fundamental research?
Like it needs to be like a world of problems that people are solving, not just like we're setting up a research fund for AI on interoperability.
So I pulled out the AI bit. I think the question was more, is there a gap there that needs to be closed? A toolkit for interoperability.
It's the automation of interoperability, of which AI will play a part, but it's only a part.
The automation. I'm going to put that down as a 3.5. I think we were sort of nearly there. There was, yeah.
Signposts, right? But my car recognizes them. It's not instrumented, right? It's applied to the use case, and I think that's the mismatch I'm having here. Is that I think the scenarios that are happening that haven't instrumented everything. It's applying it, and then once we see how that's applied, I think there's solutions. It's like
so that's the thing that bubbles up all the time, isn't it? Is what is the use case? So any recommendations that we put, does everybody agree that they should be use case led?
Yeah.
Okay, that's another clear one. So that could even be one of our top 5. Everything that we're doing here must be led by a use case. Okay. Mark has.
So can I chip one in on top of that? Because I think where we've got to on that, for me, sounds like a very good place. So the fundamental research based around a real use case, because that will end up with something really useful, which will be then applicable elsewhere. So I'm totally in favour of that. Can I add another thing which is related but completely different, which is that I think in addition to that kind of bottom-up learning by doing, which is essential in this space, and I think has been said on so many tables, I think there's also this need for an element of top-down as well. So I think that we would protect ourselves and we would put ourselves in a good position if, in addition to all of that bottom-up learning, we also did assemble an expert community to look over it and to test it and to check it. Not the expert community to tell us what to do or how to live, but to bring together the very best of the brains around this country to just make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I think that that's a complementary thing to what we just said. And it has to be described really well, because as soon as you start talking about top down, it sounds Soviet and all, we don't want that. But there's something about bringing together the people who really know their stuff. I would like to suggest Dame Wendy Hall as the chair of this kind of technical governance community, but to assemble them and when you talk about, sorry to borrow your phrase, but sciencing the shit out of this, we need to bring the best of those brains. And I think that would be a protection for us. So I would like to propose that as a recommendation as well.
Can I just ask, obviously in the context of interoperability, are you proposing an interoperable UK board?
It's a bit more than that, because I think it's specifically on the technical side. It's not trying to be everything to everything, but it's just where we have people who are deep experts in ontology, we should bring them to this fight rather than just kind of leave them in their ivory tower somewhere.
Okay, so that's the recommendation. Do we bring together the best of the best brains that we can find that understand this particular challenge from a technical perspective, and bring them together and see whether or not we can get them to agree on, or not even agree, just get them together and oversee things? As part of our governance structure, we need to have this expert technical group. Sounds eminently sensible to me.
It's not just academic though.
Okay. Best of the
practitioners like us as well as
practitioners.
Some security experts in that, because we want to get it right from a security point of view. So, I won't point out the one in the room at the moment. We need them.
Is it like an AI council, but on this particular subject?
Well, I'm gonna propose that we put this center of excellence together. That is a technical, led by Wendy Hall, Dame Wendy Hall.
So just to clarify on that, to me, a center of excellence is more about, guidance to people of how they should, how they know. Yeah. Sure. But that's a different point. I'm not saying I disagree with it, but I think that's a different point than what Mark is saying.
Cycle, but also you're actually creating the documentation so that can be referred to and kept to. So you're actually developing that knowledge to be able to maybe trickle down through the rest.
So all I'm saying is it sounds like there's two roles that are both being recommended, one being a center of excellence and one being more of an oversight body for making sure that we do the right thing. They're different, but complementary. Maybe it's the same body that does both.
But the center of excellence could be more than just this oversight group. It could also have other facets like, it could be the home where we do some of this research, which we think is missing. It could have, living labs. It could have demonstrators for the general public to allow them to gain trust in what's being done. So, it's the kind of the CRIC model, or the kind of maybe the Xerox PARC model of interoperability, but it isn't just perhaps oversight. It could be a home for other kind of things. It could be a place where, you have representation of the regulators, you have investors, you have researchers, you have, it's used for education. So it's maybe a more holistic thing than just an oversight body.
Created under the banner of digital twins. So this digital twin, the government program are ensuring. So what's the difference between all of these recently funded programs and the interoperability center of excellence?
Interoperability is much more than digital twins, however much I love them. They are a subset of interoperability. In fact, they're not even a subset of interoperability.
Somebody started to turn the lights off behind me. I don't know if that's a signal, but it's a new slide. Okay, but I think it means that we are getting close to that time, aren't we, where we've got the recommendations that have come forward as a result of this discussion. They may or may not be perfect, but I hope that you'll all agree that this discussion has led to some agreement, potential for us to bring together 5 recommendations, which is what we were looking for. So number 1, government leading by example and using procurement as a way of being able to drive that. So we were all behind that. Secondly, we need to convene the right brains and get them to lead a center of excellence. So it's a sort of, I think there's a bit of a governance piece within that to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. The AI is the last bit, isn't it? Let me see if so. Systems thinking across government, glue for regulators. I think the sense there was we wanted to make sure that the regulators first and foremost were regulating the things that they need to regulate, but most importantly, they also recognized how important it was for them to work together. We haven't really got the details around it, but it's clearly an important one. And then this final one, which has still got AI in there, but it's funding research to support interop, needs some more consideration.
Even if
at scale.
At scale.
At scale, even if you say with AI rather than for AI, it's just one
with
of the
AI.
tools. It's one of the tools we will use. Exactly, it's just a tool.
It's just other types of algorithm.
Yeah.
To work out how to do interoperability in order to do lots of clever things, whether it's probabilistic modeling or whether it's AI or whatever the tool is. AI is just a tool. It is a marvelous tool and I love it, but we shouldn't be putting any technology specific things into our recommendations, yes, particularly to government.
Finally, something we all agree on.
Okay, well, I mean, it's obviously not a perfect science, the way we've gone about getting to this stage, but I hope you feel that it's been a democratic approach to bubbling up some key issues that we can put forward. And obviously, throughout the day, we've been taking huge amounts of notes, and they will all be brought together into a longer document. But I would like to just now finish by saying thank you to my panel for what I think was a great discussion, given that you were just put on the spot and didn't know which way we were going to go, and we were making it up as based on what came out of the session today. But I'd like to extend a very warm thanks to all of you for spending the day with us today. That's a big day of interoperability. So thank you very much. And but I'd like to put my hands together for all of you.